When my son David stood in front of our neighbors at the annual Willowbrook Heights block party and casually mentioned that I was the new housekeeper they might see around, he had no idea he was talking about the woman who actually owned every single house on Maple Street, including the one he was living in rent-free. The look of embarrassment and shock that would cross his face 3 hours later, when I pulled out the property deeds showing Margaret Collins as the sole owner of the entire Willowbrook Heights development, was worth every condescending comment I'd endured from his wife Jessica and her family over the past 5 years. But that moment of revelation was just the beginning of a story that would shake our tight-knit community to its core and finally show everyone that sometimes the person you overlook as just the help actually holds all the keys to the kingdom. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. The afternoon sun was beating down mercilessly on Maple Street. As I arranged folding chairs around the rented tables for what had become Willowbrook Heights' most anticipated social event of the year. The annual block party brought together all 47 families in our exclusive suburban development, though I use the term "our" loosely since most of my neighbors had no idea I was anything more than David's aging mother who had moved in to help with household chores. I had arrived at 6 a.m. to begin setting up, just as I had for the past 3 years, ensuring the decorations were perfect, the sound system worked properly, and the vendor tables were positioned to catch the afternoon breeze. What the residents of Willowbrook Heights didn't know was that I wasn't just helping to organize their precious community gathering. I was overseeing an event on my own property, in a neighborhood I had developed and owned for the past 15 years, ever since my late husband Robert and I had purchased the old Willowbrook Mill and the surrounding 200 acres of farmland. The irony wasn't lost on me that these same people who barely acknowledged my presence were celebrating their affluent lifestyle on land that belonged entirely to me. The morning had started like any other preparation day, with me quietly going about my tasks while the neighborhood's self-appointed social hierarchy began to emerge. Caroline Mitchell, the unofficial queen bee of Maple Street, had already made 3 separate trips from her sprawling colonial at number 23 to check on my progress. Her perfectly manicured nails tapped impatiently against her coffee cup as she surveyed my work with the critical eye of someone who believed she was in charge of quality control. "Margaret, you've set the dessert table too close to the grilling station," she announced, her voice carrying that particular tone of authority that wealthy women often use when addressing people they consider beneath their social standing. "The smoke will affect the presentation of the pastries. You'll need to move everything at least 10 feet to the left." I paused in my arrangement of the red and white checkered tablecloths, looking up at Caroline with the patient expression I had perfected over years of dealing with her personality. "Of course, Caroline. I'll take care of that right away." The response was automatic, the same deferential tone I had been using with the residents of Willowbrook Heights, since David had introduced me as his widowed mother, who needed somewhere to stay while she got back on her feet. It wasn't entirely a lie, of course. I had been widowed when Robert died suddenly of a heart attack 7 years ago, and I had moved into the modest 2-bedroom house at 15 Maple Street shortly afterward. What I hadn't mentioned, and what David had never thought to ask, was that I owned the house he assumed I was living in out of his charity. I owned his house too, along with Caroline's perfectly landscaped colonial and every other property in this development that had become the crown jewel of Connecticut's suburban elite. As Caroline clicked away in her designer heels to inspect some other aspect of the party preparations, I continued setting up tables while observing the familiar social dynamics that played out every year. Linda Rodriguez emerged from her house at number 18, her arms loaded with homemade appetizers and her usual expression of frazzled determination. As the PTA president and self-designated community volunteer coordinator, Linda took these events very seriously, though she had never quite managed to break into Caroline's inner circle of neighborhood influence. Behind Linda came Dr. Rachel, Kim, the young cardiothoracic surgeon who had moved into number 31 just 2 years ago. Rachel represented the changing face of Willowbrook Heights, successful professional women who had earned their place in the community through their own achievements rather than inherited wealth or advantageous marriages. She nodded politely to me as she passed, one of the few neighbors who consistently treated me with basic courtesy rather than the dismissive tolerance I received from most others. The morning continued with a steady stream of residents emerging from their homes, each carrying contributions to the communal feast, and most barely registering my presence as anything more than background help. I had grown accustomed to this invisibility over the years, though it never stopped stinging when I overheard their casual conversations about property values, renovation projects, and investment strategies. If only they knew they were discussing modifications to homes I could approve or deny with a single phone call to my property management company. By 11 o'clock, the setup was nearly complete, and I was adjusting the positioning of the bounce house when I heard David's voice carrying across the street. He was standing with a group of neighbors near the beverage station, gesturing broadly as he spoke with the animated confidence that had served him well in his career as a pharmaceutical sales representative. My son had inherited his father's natural charisma and his ability to work a room, skills that made him popular at neighborhood gatherings, even though he had only been living in Willowbrook Heights for 3 years. The thing about living in a community like this, David was saying to Stephen Mitchell, Caroline's lawyer husband, is that you really need reliable help to maintain the lifestyle. Jessica and I both work demanding jobs. Plus, we've got Emma and Ryan's activities to coordinate. Having my mother move in has been a lifesaver. I smiled to myself as I continued working, remembering how David had presented his invitation for me to move to Willowbrook Heights. He had been genuinely concerned about my living alone in the small apartment I had rented in Hartford after Robert's death, though he had no idea that the apartment was simply a temporary arrangement while I decided what to do with the various properties in my portfolio. When he offered me the spare bedroom in his house, he thought he was providing charity to a lonely widow who needed family support. What I had never explained to David was that I had purchased his house 3 years before he moved into it. The previous owners, a young couple who had overextended themselves financially, had approached my property management company when they faced foreclosure. Rather than allow the house to go to auction and potentially attract buyers who wouldn't maintain the neighborhood standards, I had purchased it directly and then quietly arranged for it to become available for rent just as David and Jessica were house hunting in the area. The arrangement had worked perfectly for everyone involved. David and Jessica believed they had found an excellent rental property in a prestigious neighborhood. I had reliable tenants who would care for the house as if they owned it, and I had gained the perfect cover for moving into the community without drawing attention to my true role as the neighborhood's ultimate landlord. I finished adjusting the bounce house and was heading toward the sound system when I heard David's voice again, this time in response to a question from Jim Parker, the retired executive from number 42. Actually, she's been incredibly helpful with household management, David was explaining. Jessica's mother, Patricia, keeps suggesting we hire professional cleaning service. But honestly, my mother has turned into quite the housekeeper. She's got this attention to detail that you just can't find with commercial services. The comment hit me like a physical blow, though I managed to keep my expression neutral as I continued walking. Housekeeper. My own son was describing me to our neighbors as household help, reducing my role in his life to that of unpaid domestic labor. I thought about the irony of his words as I tested the microphone system. The woman he was casually dismissing as a housekeeper had spent the morning ensuring that his neighbors could enjoy their annual celebration on property she owned, using her own money to fund improvements and maintenance that kept their property values high. The conversation continued behind me, and I found myself slowing my pace to hear more of what David was sharing about our living arrangement. I have to admit, Stephen was saying, when you first mentioned your mother moving in, Jessica seemed a bit concerned about the privacy aspect. How has that worked out? It's been better than expected, David replied. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Mom keeps to herself mostly, handles a lot of the day-to-day household tasks, and the kids love having their grandmother around. Plus, she's always been good with organization and cleaning, so it's actually saved us money on hiring help. There it was again. The reduction of my presence in their lives to economic utility. The assumption that my value lay primarily in my ability to perform unpaid labor. I wondered what David would think if he knew that the money he believed he was saving on household help was insignificant compared to the rent-free housing I was providing him, or that the property taxes on his house alone exceeded what most people earned in a year. As the morning progressed into afternoon, more neighbors arrived, and the social dynamics of the community became more pronounced. I watched Caroline Mitchell hold court near the dessert table, surrounded by her usual circle of admiring followers, who hung on her every pronouncement about community standards and social expectations. Patricia Henderson, Jessica's mother, had arrived fashionably late and was making her rounds through the crowd, inspecting everything with the critical eye of someone who considered herself an expert on proper entertaining. Patricia had never warmed to me, though she was too well-bred to express her disapproval directly. From our first meeting 3 years ago, she had made it clear through subtle comments and meaningful glances that she considered my presence in David and Jessica's household to be somewhat inappropriate. A woman of my age, she had suggested more than once, should have her own independent living situation rather than relying on her children for housing and support. If only she knew that her disapproval was directed toward a woman who could purchase her family's suburban mansion without affecting my monthly budget, or that the independence she felt I lacked included ownership of properties in 3 states and investment accounts that generated more passive income than most people earned from full-time careers. The irony of my situation had become increasingly difficult to bear over the past year. When I had first moved to Willowbrook Heights, the anonymity had felt liberating after years of being known primarily as Robert's widow, or as the woman who had inherited his real estate development business. But as time passed, and I watched my son's family struggle with financial pressures they were too proud to discuss, I had begun to question the wisdom of maintaining my facade. David and Jessica worked demanding jobs and worried constantly about college savings for Emma and Ryan, about home repairs they couldn't afford, about the rising costs of maintaining their lifestyle in an expensive community. Meanwhile, I lived quietly in their spare bedroom, contributing to household expenses when I could do so without raising suspicion, and watching them stress about money while sitting on resources that could solve their problems permanently. The block party reached its peak energy around 2 o'clock, with children running between the bounce house and the face painting station, while adults clustered in conversation groups that roughly reflected the neighborhood's social hierarchy. Caroline Mitchell's circle dominated the prime real estate near the food tables, while newer residents and those considered less socially prominent gathered in smaller groups around the periphery. I was refilling the water station when I overheard a conversation that stopped me in my tracks. Jessica was standing with Amanda Wilson, her younger sister, and Patricia Henderson near the dessert table, speaking in the low tones that women use when they want to have a private conversation in a public space. "I'm just saying," Patricia was murmuring, "that at some point you need to consider the long-term implications. Having her living in your house indefinitely isn't a sustainable solution." "It's not indefinite," Jessica replied, though her voice carried a note of uncertainty. "David keeps saying it's temporary, just until she gets more settled and maybe finds a place of her own." Amanda nodded sympathetically. "But it's been 3 years, Jess, and honestly, having your mother-in-law doing your housework feels a bit awkward when we're trying to maintain a certain image in this neighborhood." The words hit me harder than I had expected. Not because I was surprised by their sentiment, but because hearing it articulated so clearly forced me to confront the reality of how my own family perceived my presence in their lives. I wasn't a beloved grandmother and mother sharing in their family life. I was an obligation, an embarrassment, a problem they were too polite to address directly. I continued refilling water bottles while straining to hear the rest of their conversation, though part of me knew I would regret whatever else I might overhear. The thing is, Jessica continued, she's actually been really helpful. The house has never been cleaner. She's great with the kids' schedules. And David seems more relaxed knowing someone's there to handle things when we're both working late. But that's exactly the problem, Patricia interjected. You're treating her like hired help instead of family. Either she's your mother-in-law who deserves to be treated as an equal member of the household, or she's domestic staff who should be properly compensated. This middle ground you've created is uncomfortable for everyone. Amanda nodded again. Plus, think about how it looks to the neighbors. The Hendersons and the Mitchells don't have live-in relatives doing their housework. It sends a certain message about your financial situation. I felt my hands beginning to shake slightly as I processed the implications of their words. They were embarrassed by my presence, not because they disliked me personally, but because having me live with them and perform household tasks suggested they couldn't afford professional help. In their social circle, live-in relatives were a sign of either financial struggle or cultural differences that didn't align with Willowbrook Heights' carefully curated image. The conversation was interrupted by Emma, my 8-year-old granddaughter, who came running up to Jessica with her face painted like a butterfly and her arms full of prizes from the various game stations. "Mommy, look what I won!" Emma exclaimed, holding up a stuffed animal and a small trophy. "Grandma Maggie helped me win the ring toss game. She's really good at it." "That's wonderful, sweetheart," Jessica replied, though I caught the slightly strained smile she exchanged with her mother and sister. "Why don't you go show Daddy what you won?" As Emma skipped away, Patricia resumed the conversation with renewed intensity. "That's another thing," she said quietly. "The children are getting too attached. Emma especially talks about her grandmother, constantly, and it's going to be confusing for them when this arrangement eventually changes." I finished with the water station and moved toward the trash collection area, my mind reeling from what I had overheard. Not only was my presence an embarrassment to my son's family, but they were actively planning for my eventual departure and worrying about how to manage the children's attachment to me. I thought about Emma's excited face as she shared her prizes, about Ryan's habit of crawling into my lap during movie nights, about the bedtime stories I had been reading to them for 3 years. The afternoon continued with more social mingling, but I found it increasingly difficult to maintain my pleasant demeanor as I processed the implications of Jessica's conversation with her family. Every interaction felt charged with new meaning. Every casual comment about household arrangements or family dynamics carried undertones I had never noticed before. Around 4 o'clock, as the party was beginning to wind down and people were starting the cleanup process, I was collecting empty plates when I heard David's voice again, this time in conversation with Dr. Rachel Kim and Tom Bradley, the widower from number 36. "The neighborhood really has maintained its character over the years," Rachel was saying. "When I was house hunting, my realtor mentioned that the original developer had very specific standards for the community design." David nodded enthusiastically. "That attention to detail really shows. The property values here have been incredibly stable, even during market downturns. Jessica and I feel lucky to have found such a well-managed rental property." Tom, who had lived in Willowbrook Heights since its original development, smiled knowingly. The developer was quite visionary, from what I understand. Someone with real expertise in creating sustainable communities. Though I don't think anyone knows much about them personally. Very private operation. I paused in my plate collection, curious to hear what Tom might know about the neighborhood's origins. He had been one of the first residents when Robert and I had completed the initial phase of development, though he had no idea of my connection to the project. "I heard it was a husband and wife team," Rachel added. "The husband died some years ago, but apparently the wife still manages the properties through some kind of trust or management company. Very hands-off approach, which is nice. No micromanaging or intrusive oversight." David looked interested in this information, probably because it related to his own rental situation. "Do you know anything about the rental policies?" he asked Tom. Our lease has been really straightforward, but we've never actually met the owner or dealt with anyone except the property management company. Tom shrugged. Same here. I own my place, but I know several neighbors who rent from the same entity. Everyone says the same thing. Very professional, but anonymous. Rent increases are minimal, maintenance is handled promptly, and there's never any hassle about lease renewals or property modifications. As they continued discussing the mysterious property owner who managed their community so effectively, I felt a strange mixture of pride and frustration. Pride, because they were acknowledging the quality of work that Robert and I had put into creating Willowbrook Heights, the careful planning and ongoing investment that had made it such a desirable place to live. Frustration, because I was standing 3 feet away from them, invisible in my role as the helpful mother-in-law who cleaned up after their parties. The conversation was interrupted by Caroline Mitchell's voice calling for attention from the center of the gathering area. She was standing beside the microphone, tapping a spoon against her wine glass in the universal signal for a group announcement. "If I could have everyone's attention for just a moment," Caroline announced, her voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to being heard. As we wrap up another wonderful block party, I wanted to take a moment to thank everyone who contributed to making this event such a success. She proceeded to thank the various volunteers and contributors, acknowledging the dessert committee, the games organizers, and the cleanup crew with the gracious efficiency of a seasoned hostess. I continued collecting plates and cups, expecting to be overlooked as usual, when Caroline's voice picked up a different tone. "I also want to acknowledge some of our community members who may not be official residents, but who contribute so much to our neighborhood's success," she said, her gaze settling on me with what I could only describe as benevolent condescension. Margaret Collins has been such a dedicated helper with our events, and we're grateful for her willingness to take care of the details that make these gatherings possible. The scattered applause that followed felt more like acknowledgement of a service provider than recognition of a community member, and I found myself smiling and nodding while internally cringing at the patronizing tone of Caroline's thanks. Around me, neighbors who had barely spoken to me all afternoon offered polite smiles and brief nods before returning to their conversations. It was in that moment, standing in the middle of a community celebration on property I owned, being thanked for my service by a woman who lived in a house I could evict her from with 30 days' notice, that I realized I had reached my breaking point. 3 years of invisibility, of being treated as helpful hired help, of watching my own son describe me as a housekeeper to neighbors who had no idea they were discussing the woman who controlled their housing security. The decision crystallized in my mind with sudden clarity. It was time for Willowbrook Heights to meet Margaret Collins not as David's helpful mother or as their reliable event volunteer, but as the woman who had created their perfect community and who held the power to change their lives with a single conversation. As the block party wound down and neighbors began heading back to their houses, I helped with the final cleanup while mentally preparing for what would happen next. Tomorrow, I would make some phone calls to my property management company, my attorney, and my financial advisor. It was time to step out of the shadows and reclaim my rightful place in the community I had built. The woman they had overlooked as just the help was about to show them exactly who they had been dismissing, all along. The evening after the block party settled into the familiar rhythm that had defined my life in Willowbrook Heights for the past 3 years. David and Jessica retreated to their bedroom to discuss the day's events while Emma and Ryan played video games in the living room, their excited chatter about face painting and prizes gradually giving way to the quieter sounds of evening routine. I moved through the house collecting the last remnants of party cleanup, folding chairs and storing leftover decorations in the garage with the methodical efficiency that had earned me Caroline Mitchell's patronizing praise. What my family didn't realize as they settled into their comfortable evening was that I had spent the previous hour making mental notes of every condescending comment, every dismissive glance, and every casual reference to my role as their unpaid domestic help. The conversation I had overheard between Jessica and her family had crystallized something that had been building for months. A growing awareness that my presence in their lives had been reduced to utility rather than valued for the love and support I had intended to provide. As I wiped down the kitchen counters for the second time that day, I listened to David's voice drifting from their bedroom as he debriefed Jessica about his conversations with the neighbors. His tone carried the satisfied energy of someone who felt he had successfully navigated important social connections, cementing his family's place in the community hierarchy through careful relationship management. I think Stephen Mitchell might have some leads on commercial real estate opportunities, David was saying, his voice carrying through the thin walls of the ranch-style house. He mentioned that there are some properties coming available in the Hartford area that could be good investments if we can figure out the financing. Jessica's response was muffled, but I caught enough to understand her concerns about their financial situation. They had been house poor since moving to Willowbrook Heights, stretching their combined salaries to afford the rent on a property in a neighborhood that projected the success they aspired to achieve. The irony wasn't lost on me that they were struggling to pay rent to a property management company that forwarded their payments directly to my personal bank account. The children's bedtime routine provided a brief respite from my growing frustration. Emma insisted on showing me her butterfly face paint one more time before washing it off, and Ryan demanded his favorite bedtime story about dragons and brave knights. These moments with my grandchildren reminded me why I had originally agreed to David's invitation to move in with their family, the genuine love and connection that had made the arrangement feel like a blessing rather than the burden it had apparently become. After tucking the children into their beds, I retreated to my small bedroom at the back of the house, the space that David had presented as a temporary arrangement, but which had become my primary residence for longer than I had lived anywhere since Robert's death. The room was comfortable enough, with a double bed, a small dresser, and a window that looked out onto the backyard where Emma and Ryan played on the swing set I had purchased and installed, without mentioning that it cost more than most families' monthly mortgage payments. Sitting on the edge of my bed, I pulled out my laptop and began reviewing documents that none of my family knew existed: property deeds, financial statements, and business correspondence that told a very different story about Margaret Collins than the one my son had been sharing with the neighbors. The woman they described as a helpful housekeeper was actually reviewing quarterly reports from a real estate portfolio worth more than $40 million, including every property in the Willowbrook Heights development where we lived. The contrast between my public persona and my private reality had become increasingly absurd over the past year. During the day, I performed the role of the grateful mother-in-law who contributed to household management in exchange for housing, security. In the evenings, I conducted business calls with property managers, reviewed investment opportunities, and managed charitable giving that exceeded most people's annual salaries. The cognitive dissonance was exhausting, but it had also provided me with unprecedented insight into how people treated those they perceived as economically vulnerable. My phone buzzed with a text message from Maria Santos, my property manager, who handled the day-to-day operations of the Willowbrook Heights development. The message was routine, requesting approval for landscaping upgrades in the common areas, but it reminded me of the infrastructure that supported my neighbors' comfortable lives. Every perfectly maintained street, every functioning streetlight, every snow removal service that kept their driveways clear was funded through my investment in the community I had created with Robert 15 years earlier. The landscaping proposal included improvements to the area around the community mailboxes, the small park where children played, and the entrance signage that welcomed residents and visitors to Willowbrook Heights. Maria had included cost estimates and contractor recommendations, treating the decisions as routine business matters that required my approval as the property owner. What she didn't know was that I would likely encounter several of my neighbors tomorrow, people who would chat casually about the improvements while having no idea they were speaking to the person who had authorized and funded the work. I approved. Maria's proposal via email and then opened the folder on my laptop that contained financial records for the past 3 years of my residency in Willowbrook Heights. The numbers told a story that would have shocked David and Jessica if they had been able to see them. While they struggled to make their monthly rent payments and worried about saving for their children's college education, I had been quietly subsidizing their lifestyle in ways they couldn't imagine. The house they rented had been purchased by my holding company specifically to provide them with housing in a neighborhood they couldn't otherwise afford. Their rent covered less than half of the property's actual market value, with the difference being absorbed by my accounts without David or Jessica ever knowing they were receiving what amounted to a substantial monthly gift. Additionally, many of the home improvements they attributed to their own initiative and investment had actually been funded through my property management company, disguised as routine maintenance and upgrades. The children's swing set, the new appliances that had replaced aging units, the fresh paint and updated flooring they believed they had negotiated as part of their lease agreement. All of these improvements had been my investments in creating a better living environment for my family. Even the high-quality internet service and security system that David praised as exceptional value for their rental property were premium services that I had arranged and paid for without their knowledge. As I reviewed these financial records, I felt a mixture of satisfaction and sadness that had become familiar over the past year. Satisfaction because I had been able to provide my family with security and comfort without damaging David's pride or creating complicated family dynamics around money. Sadness because they had no appreciation for what they were receiving. And worse, they had begun to take my presence and contributions for granted in ways that reduced me to unpaid household help. The sound of David and Jessica's conversation had quieted, replaced by the typical evening sounds of a family settling down for the night. Television programs playing softly in the living room, the dishwasher running its cycle, the central air conditioning system cycling on to maintain the comfortable temperature that kept everyone happy. All of these domestic comforts were possible because of financial security that my family attributed to their own hard work and good fortune, never knowing that their loving mother and grandmother was the invisible safety net that made their lifestyle sustainable. I closed my laptop and prepared for bed, but sleep proved elusive as my mind continued processing the events of the day. Caroline Mitchell's patronizing thanks, Jessica's conversation about my embarrassing presence in their household, David's casual description of me as household help to neighbors who respected his professional success, while dismissing his mother as invisible domestic labor. Each memory stung fresh, and together they painted a picture of relationships built on fundamental misunderstandings about worth, contribution, and respect. The next morning brought the return of normal routines, with David and Jessica rushing through breakfast before heading to their respective jobs while Emma and Ryan prepared for their summer day camp activities. I moved through my usual morning tasks, preparing lunch boxes, organizing backpacks, and ensuring everyone had what they needed for their day ahead. The routine was comfortable and familiar, but now it felt charged with new meaning after the previous day's revelations about how my family perceived my role in their lives. David paused at the kitchen counter as he gathered his work materials, his expression showing the slight distraction that usually preceded important conversations. I had learned to recognize this look over the years, the way he prepared himself mentally before discussing topics he found potentially uncomfortable or complicated. "Mom," he said, pouring coffee into his travel mug, "I wanted to talk to you about something. Jessica and I have been discussing our living situation, and we think it might be time to consider some changes." The words hit me exactly as I had expected, though hearing them spoken aloud still sent a chill through my chest. I continued wiping down the breakfast table while keeping my expression neutral, waiting for him to continue with what I suspected would be a carefully rehearsed speech about family independence and changing circumstances. "It's not that we aren't grateful for everything you've done," David continued, his tone carrying the overly gentle quality that people use when delivering news they expect to be painful. "Having you here has been wonderful for the kids, and you've been incredibly helpful with household management. but Jessica's mother has pointed out some valid concerns about long-term arrangements. I set down the dishcloth and turned to face my son directly, meeting his eyes with the calm expression I had perfected during years of business negotiations. "What kind of concerns, David?" He shifted uncomfortably, clearly wishing Jessica were present to help navigate this conversation. "Patricia thinks that having you live with us indefinitely might not be the best situation for anyone involved. She's suggested that it might be healthier for you to have your own independent living situation. Maybe a nice apartment in a senior community where you could develop your own social connections." The phrase "senior community" hung in the air between us like a slap. At 62, I was hardly ready for the kind of assisted living arrangement that Patricia Henderson apparently envisioned for me, though I supposed that from her perspective, a woman who lived with her adult children and performed household labor must be someone who needed care rather than someone providing it. "I see," I replied carefully. "And what do you think about Patricia's suggestions?" David ran his hand through his hair, a gesture I remembered from his childhood when he was trying to work through difficult problems. "I think she has some valid points about independence and long-term planning. Plus, if we're being honest, having you handle so much of the household work has created an unbalanced dynamic. We should probably be paying for professional cleaning services rather than relying on family members to do that labor." There it was again, the reduction of my contributions to their household to labor that should be compensated rather than appreciated as expressions of love and care. I wondered what David would say if he knew that the money he was planning to spend on professional cleaning services would ultimately flow back to me through the property management company that handled their rental payments. "Have you thought about where you'd like me to look for this independent living situation?" I asked, maintaining my calm tone despite the growing anger I felt at being discussed and planned for like a problem to be solved rather than a family member whose preferences might matter. "Well," David said, brightening slightly as he moved into problem-solving mode, "there are some really nice senior communities in Hartford. Patricia has a friend who moved into one last year and absolutely loves it. They have social activities, meal services, and you wouldn't have to worry about maintenance or household management. It could be a great opportunity for you to build your own life rather than just helping with ours." The phrase, "just helping with ours," was perhaps the most revealing thing David had said in the entire conversation. In his mind, my presence in their household had been reduced to auxiliary support rather than meaningful family connection. I was an extra pair of hands for childcare and housework, not a beloved grandmother and mother whose company they valued, for its own sake. I nodded thoughtfully, as if seriously considering his suggestions. "How soon were you thinking this transition might happen?" David's relief at my apparently reasonable response was visible in his relaxed shoulders and easier tone. "We don't want to rush anything, of course. Maybe over the next few months we could start looking at options. And then perhaps by the end of the year you could be settled somewhere that really suits your needs." By the end of the year, 6 months to find somewhere else to live because my presence had become an embarrassment to my son's wife and her socially ambitious mother. I thought about the irony of being asked to leave a house I owned so that my family could maintain their image in a neighborhood where I was every resident's landlord. "That sounds reasonable," I said, maintaining the cooperative tone that David clearly expected. "I'll start researching some options." David's face lit up with genuine relief and gratitude. "Thanks, Mom. I really appreciate how understanding you're being about this. I know it's a big change, but I think it could be really positive for everyone involved." After David and Jessica left for work and the children departed for day camp, I found myself alone in the house with a clarity of purpose I hadn't felt in years. The conversation with David had removed any remaining doubt about how my family perceived my role in their lives and what they expected from our relationship. Going forward, I was a temporary inconvenience to be managed rather than a treasured family member to be cherished. I made myself a cup of coffee and settled at the kitchen table with my laptop. But instead of researching senior communities in Hartford, I opened my business files and began reviewing the documentation that would reshape everyone's understanding of our family dynamic. Property deeds, financial statements, and legal documents that would transform me from Margaret the helpful housekeeper into Margaret Collins, property developer and business owner. The first call I made was to Maria Santos, my property manager, requesting a meeting to discuss changes in how I wanted to handle the Willowbrook Heights properties. For 3 years, I had maintained careful distance from the day-to-day management of the neighborhood, allowing Maria's company to handle everything, while I remained anonymous. But if David wanted independence, and Jessica wanted to eliminate the embarrassment of having me in their household, then perhaps it was time for them to understand exactly what kind of independence they could afford. The second call was to my attorney, Helen Crawford, a sharp woman in her 50s who had been handling my legal affairs since Robert's death. Helen had questioned my decision to live anonymously among my tenants from the beginning, warning me that the arrangement could create complicated conflicts of interest and emotional entanglements. Now I needed her expertise to help me navigate the process of revealing my true position without creating legal problems for anyone involved. The third call was to my financial advisor, who managed the investment portfolio that generated far more income than most people in Willowbrook Heights earned from their demanding careers. If I was going to step out of the shadows and reclaim my identity, I wanted to understand exactly what resources I had available and what options existed for managing my properties more directly. As I made these calls and scheduled meetings for the following week, I felt a weight lifting from my shoulders that I hadn't even realized I was carrying. For 3 years, I had been living a lie, pretending to be someone I wasn't in order to maintain peace and avoid complicated family dynamics. But the cost of that pretense had been my own dignity and self-respect. And now my family was asking me to sacrifice even more by removing myself from their lives entirely. Part 3. The Breaking Point Incident. The breaking point came 3 days after David's gentle suggestion that I find alternative living arrangements during what should have been an ordinary Thursday morning in the Collins household. I was in the kitchen preparing breakfast when Jessica's sister Amanda arrived unannounced, letting herself in through the front door with the casual familiarity of someone who considered herself part of the family's inner circle. Amanda worked as a marketing consultant and had recently landed what she described as a major client in the luxury real estate sector, a development that had filled her with professional confidence and social ambition. I was scrambling eggs when Amanda breezed into the kitchen, her designer handbag slung over her shoulder, and her phone pressed to her ear as she conducted what sounded like an important business call. She gestured vaguely in my direction, a distracted acknowledgement of my presence that had become typical of how Jessica's family interacted with me, before settling at the kitchen table to continue her conversation. I couldn't help but overhear Amanda's side of the call as I continued cooking, and what I heard made my hands tighten around the spatula I was holding. She was speaking to someone about a luxury development project, discussing property values and market positioning with the kind of authoritative tone that came from recent success in a competitive industry. The Willowbrook Heights area is absolutely prime real estate, Amanda was saying, her voice carrying the enthusiasm of someone who had discovered an excellent investment opportunity. We're talking about a community that was developed with incredible attention to detail, and the property values have remained stable even during market fluctuations. The original developer clearly knew what they were doing. I paused in my cooking, curious to hear what Amanda might know about the neighborhood's development history. As someone who worked in real estate marketing, she might have access to information about the business side of Willowbrook Heights that could be interesting, though I doubted she had any idea about my personal connection to the project. The thing is, Amanda continued, these kinds of established communities don't come on the market very often. When they do, you're looking at significant investment potential, especially if you can get in at the ground level of any expansion or redevelopment plans. Her conversation partner must have asked about the current ownership structure, because Amanda's tone became more speculative and animated. That's the interesting part, she said, lowering her voice slightly as if sharing confidential information. The ownership is apparently held through some kind of private trust or holding company. Very mysterious, very hands-off management style. Nobody in the community seems to know who actually owns the properties, which could mean there might be opportunities for the right investor to make contact and explore partnership possibilities. I set down the spatula and turned to look at Amanda, directly, though she was too absorbed in her conversation to notice my attention. The eggs were beginning to overcook, but I found myself more interested in hearing her theories about the mysterious property owner than in managing breakfast preparation. My contact in commercial real estate thinks the trust structure might indicate that the original developer is looking to liquidate or restructure their holdings, Amanda was explaining. These kinds of anonymous ownership arrangements are often used when people want to sell without dealing with public negotiations or community relations complications. The irony of listening to Amanda speculate about my business intentions while standing in a kitchen where I was preparing breakfast was so absurd that I almost laughed out loud. Here was Jessica's sister, the marketing expert who had positioned herself as the family's authority on real estate trends, developing elaborate theories about property investments while completely oblivious to the fact that she was discussing these matters with the actual property owner. Amanda's conversation continued for several more minutes, with increasingly detailed speculation about market opportunities and investment strategies. She discussed the potential for expanding the Willowbrook Heights development, the possibility of converting some residential properties to commercial use, and the advantages of acquiring property from an anonymous seller who might be motivated to close deals quickly and quietly. After ending her call, Amanda finally acknowledged my presence in the kitchen with the kind of bright, superficial attention that she typically directed towards service providers and household help. "Good morning, Margaret," she said, sliding her phone into her handbag. "I hope you don't mind me letting myself in. Jessica said you'd be here with the kids while she and David are at work." "Of course not," I replied, returning to the overcooked eggs with resignation. "Would you like some breakfast?" I was just finishing up. Amanda glanced at her expensive watch and shook her head. "I can't stay long. I'm actually meeting with a client this morning about some exciting property investment opportunities. Did you happen to overhear any of my conversation just now?" The question caught me off guard, though I tried to keep my expression neutral. "A little bit. It sounded like you were discussing real estate." Amanda's eyes lit up with the enthusiasm of someone who loved talking about her professional successes. "I'm working with some investors who are interested in this area. Apparently, there might be some significant opportunities coming available in neighborhoods like this one, properties that have been held by private owners who are ready to sell." She stood up and moved to the kitchen window, gazing out at the street with the appraising look of someone evaluating potential investments. The thing about communities like Willowbrook Heights is that they're incredibly well managed, which usually means the ownership is professional and sophisticated, but they're also somewhat mysterious, which could indicate opportunities for the right kind of approach. I continued transferring eggs to plates, trying to process what Amanda was suggesting. It sounded like she was considering some kind of investment scheme involving the neighborhood where her sister lived, possibly without understanding that such investments would directly affect her family's housing situation. "Have you ever wondered who actually owns this neighborhood?" Amanda asked, turning back toward me with genuine curiosity. "I mean, Jessica and David rent their house, but they've never met the owner or dealt with anyone except a property management company. It's all very anonymous and hands-off." I set down the serving spoon and looked at Amanda directly. "What would you do if you found out who the owner was?" Amanda's smile became more calculating, the expression of someone who had spotted a potential business opportunity. "Well, that would depend on what kind of person they were and what their goals might be. If they were looking to sell, there could be significant opportunities for investors who approach them with the right kind of proposal." She paused, clearly warming to her subject. "The thing about anonymous property owners is that they're often older people, maybe widows or retirees who inherited real estate, but don't want to deal with the complications of active management. They might be very motivated to sell to someone who could take over the headaches and give them a lump sum for their retirement. The patronizing assumptions in Amanda's analysis were breathtaking. She had constructed an entire narrative about the mysterious property owner, based on stereotypes about older women and inherited wealth, never considering that the owner might be someone who had chosen anonymity for strategic reasons rather than out of incompetence or disinterest. "That's an interesting theory," I said carefully. "Have you shared these ideas with Jessica and David?" Amanda shook her head. "Not yet. I wanted to do more research first and see if I could identify the actual owner before bringing them into any potential deals. But if something develops, I definitely want to help them take advantage of any opportunities." The phone rang before I could respond, interrupting Amanda's real estate speculation with the practical demands of household management. Emma was calling from day camp with a stomachache, requesting to be picked up early, which meant I needed to drive across town, while Amanda continued her planning for investment opportunities in my own neighborhood. As I gathered my car keys and purse, Amanda was already pulling out her phone to make another business call, settling back at the kitchen table as if she owned the place. I could hear her dialing as I headed toward the garage, and her voice carried through the house as she began discussing her theories about Willowbrook Heights with another potential business contact. The drive to Emma's day camp gave me time to process what I had overheard and what it might mean for my family's future. Amanda was actively researching ways to profit from property investments in our neighborhood, developing strategies that could affect every resident's housing security, including her own sister's family. She was doing this while sitting in my kitchen, eating food I had prepared, in a house I owned, speculating about business deals with a property owner she couldn't identify. Emma was waiting in the camp office when I arrived, looking pale and tired, but perking up when she saw me. The drive home was filled with her chatter about morning activities and friend drama, providing a welcome distraction from the complexity of adult relationships and business scheming. My granddaughter's uncomplicated affection reminded me of what had originally motivated my decision to move in with David's family: the simple desire to be part of their daily lives and to contribute to their happiness and security. But when we returned to the house, Amanda was still there, and she had apparently been joined by Patricia Henderson, Jessica's mother, who had arrived with a folder of documents and an expression of determined efficiency. The two women were seated at the dining room table with papers spread between them, engaged in what appeared to be serious business planning. "Margaret?" Patricia said when she saw me enter with Emma. "How convenient that you're back. Amanda has been telling me about some fascinating investment opportunities in this area, and we wanted to discuss something with you." I helped Emma get settled with a snack and some quiet activities before joining Patricia and Amanda at the dining room table, curious about what kind of discussion they thought we needed to have. The papers between them appeared to be real estate listings, property, value assessments, and what looked like preliminary financial projections. "Amanda has discovered that there might be some significant property investment opportunities in Willowbrook Heights," Patricia explained, her tone carrying the authority of someone accustomed to making important family decisions. "We think this could be an excellent chance for our family to build some real wealth, but we need everyone to cooperate with the research and planning process." I looked between the two women, trying to understand what kind of cooperation they thought they needed. From me, "What exactly are you planning?" Amanda leaned forward with obvious excitement. "We think we can identify the property owner and approach them with an investment proposal. Older property owners, especially women who inherited real estate, are often very motivated to sell if they're approached correctly." Patricia nodded approvingly. "The key is to present ourselves as serious investors who can handle the transaction professionally and quickly. We don't want to get involved in lengthy negotiations or complicated legal processes." The assumption that I would somehow assist them in approaching myself with an investment proposal was so bizarre that I struggled to formulate a response. They were asking for my help in researching and contacting a property owner who was sitting at the same table with them, planning to convince her to sell properties they didn't know she owned. How exactly would you want me to help with this research? I asked. Amanda pulled out a notebook filled with handwritten notes. We need to gather information from people in the neighborhood, try to identify anyone who might have direct contact with the property owner or the management company. Since you're here during the day and interact with neighbors, you might be able to pick up useful information that we couldn't get otherwise. Patricia's expression became more focused and businesslike. The thing is, Margaret, this could be a significant opportunity for David and Jessica's financial future. If we can put together the right investment group and approach the property owner strategically, we might be able to secure not just their house, but several properties in the neighborhood. The conversation was interrupted by Emma, who had finished her snack and wanted attention for a craft project she was working on. As I helped her with gluing and cutting, I listened to Amanda and Patricia continue their planning, discussing timelines and financial strategies for approaching a property owner. They had never met about investments they couldn't afford in properties they didn't understand. Their assumption that they could manipulate an anonymous elderly woman into selling valuable real estate for below-market prices was both insulting and revealing about how they viewed older women in general. They were planning to take advantage of someone they assumed would be vulnerable to pressure and flattery, never considering that the property owner might be someone who had chosen anonymity as a business strategy rather than out of weakness or confusion. When David and Jessica returned from work that evening, Amanda and Patricia were still at the house, having spent the entire day developing their investment scheme and waiting to present their ideas to the rest of the family. David looked tired from his day of pharmaceutical sales, but his expression brightened when he saw the business documents spread across the dining room table. "What's all this?" he asked, loosening his tie as he surveyed the papers and financial projections that Amanda had prepared. Amanda practically vibrated with excitement as she launched into her presentation. "David, this could be huge for your family's financial future. I've discovered some incredible investment opportunities right here in Willowbrook Heights, and I think we can put together a deal that could set you up for long-term wealth building." Jessica appeared from the bedroom where she had gone to change out of her work clothes, looking curious about the business discussion that had apparently taken over their dining room. Patricia immediately began explaining the property investment scheme, describing Amanda's research and their theories about approaching the anonymous property owner. As the family discussion continued around me, I found myself observing the dynamics, with new clarity about where I fit in their planning and decision-making processes. They discussed financial strategies that would affect their housing situation without asking for my input. They made assumptions about my role in researching property ownership without considering whether I might have opinions about their scheme. They planned for significant changes in their lives while treating me as a resource to be utilized rather than a family member whose perspective might be valuable. The breaking point came when Patricia turned to me with an expression of determined efficiency and said, "Margaret, we're going to need you to be our eyes and ears in the neighborhood while we develop this investment strategy. Since you're here during the day and people trust you, you'll be able to gather information that we couldn't get through official channels." The assumption that I would spy on my neighbors to help my family take advantage of a property owner they couldn't identify was the final insult in a conversation filled with condescending assumptions and manipulative planning. They wanted me to betray the trust of people who had accepted me as a harmless part of their community in order to help Amanda and Patricia profit from real estate investments they didn't understand. I looked around the table at my family, seeing them clearly for perhaps the first time since I had moved into their house 3 years earlier. David, eager for financial opportunities that might solve his money worries. Jessica, supportive of anything that might improve their economic situation. Patricia, viewing me as a useful tool for gathering intelligence. Amanda, seeing me as an unwitting accomplice in her business schemes. None of them had asked what I thought about their investment plans. None of them had considered whether I might have concerns about their approach to property ownership or their assumptions about anonymous sellers. None of them had questioned whether involving me in their research might put me in an uncomfortable or compromising position. I stood up from the dining room table, my decision crystallizing with sudden clarity. I think I need to make some phone calls, I said quietly. There are some things about this property investment situation that you should know before you proceed any further. The conversation stopped as everyone turned to look at me, their expressions showing surprise at my interruption of their planning session. David looked particularly puzzled, clearly not understanding why I would need to make calls about their real estate research. "What kind of phone calls?" Amanda asked, her tone suggesting mild annoyance at having her presentation interrupted. I looked directly at each of them, meeting their eyes with a calmness I felt for the first time in months. "I need to contact the property owner of Willowbrook Heights. There are some things she should know about the investment approaches being planned for her neighborhood." The silence that followed was complete and profound. 4 faces stared at me, with expressions ranging from confusion to dawning suspicion, as if they were beginning to sense that something about this conversation was not proceeding according to their expectations. "How exactly do you plan to contact someone whose identity we've been trying to determine for weeks?" Patricia asked, her voice carrying a sharp edge of skepticism. I smiled for the first time all day, feeling a weight lifting from my shoulders, as I prepared to step out of the shadows I had inhabited for 3 long years. "That's easy, Patricia. I have her phone number. In fact, I have all of her contact information, her business records, and her legal documentation. Would you like me to arrange a meeting?" Part 4. The Hidden Foundation. The silence in the dining room stretched uncomfortably as my family processed what I had just said about contacting the mysterious property owner of Willowbrook Heights. David was the first to break the tension, his expression shifting from confusion to concern, as he tried to understand why his mother would claim to have contact information for someone they had been unable to identify. "Mom," he said carefully, "how would you have the owner's phone number? We've been working with the property management company for 3 years, and they've never provided any direct contact information." I remained standing beside the dining room table, looking down at the real estate documents and investment projections that Amanda and Patricia had spread across the surface. The irony of the situation was almost overwhelming, seeing my own property, values, and market analyses being used to plan approaches to a person who was standing in the same room with them. "Before I answer that question," I said, keeping my voice calm and measured, "I think you should know something about the research you've been doing. The property owner you're planning to approach isn't some elderly widow who inherited real estate and doesn't understand its value. She's a businesswoman who has been actively managing this community for 15 years. Amanda leaned forward with obvious skepticism. "How could you possibly know that? We've done extensive research, and there's no public information about the owner's background or business experience." Patricia's expression had become more suspicious, her eyes narrowing as she studied my face for signs of deception or confusion. "Margaret, I think you may be misunderstanding something about this situation. The property ownership is held through anonymous trusts and holding companies. There's no way for residents to have direct contact with the actual owner." I walked to the kitchen and retrieved my laptop, bringing it back to the dining room table, where my family continued to watch me with growing bewilderment. Opening the computer, I accessed files that I had never shown to anyone in my family, documents that would transform their understanding of who Margaret Collins actually was. "Let me show you something," I said, turning the laptop screen toward them. "These are the property deeds for every house in Willowbrook Heights, including this one. You'll notice that they're all registered to Willowbrook Development Holdings, which is a company I established with my late husband Robert in 2008. David leaned closer to examine the screen, his expression changing from confusion to disbelief as he read the legal documents displayed on my laptop. The property deeds clearly showed ownership by the holding company, but more importantly, they showed the company's registration information and principal officers. "This shows you and Dad as the company founders," David said slowly, his voice carrying a note of uncertainty as he tried to process what he was seeing. "But that doesn't mean you still own the properties. Companies change ownership, especially after someone dies." I clicked to another set of documents, pulling up the current corporate registration and ownership records that showed my name as the sole principal of Willowbrook Development Holdings. The documents were dated and notarized, clearly establishing my continued ownership and management authority over all properties in the development. Your father and I purchased the original 200 acres in 2007, I explained, watching their faces as they absorbed this information. We spent 2 years planning and developing the community, designing everything from the street layouts to the architectural standards. The first houses were completed in 2009, and we've been gradually expanding the development ever since. Jessica had been silent throughout this revelation, but now she spoke with a voice that carried a note of panic. Are you saying that you own our house? The house we've been renting for 3 years? I nodded, clicking to display their rental agreement and payment history. You've been excellent tenants, always paying your rent on time and taking good care of the property. What you probably don't know is that your monthly payments have been about 40% below market rate for comparable properties in this area. The family stared at the screen in stunned silence as I showed them rental payment records that clearly demonstrated the subsidized nature of their housing arrangement. For 3 years, they had been paying rent that covered basic property expenses, while I absorbed the difference between their payments and the property's actual market value. Amanda was the first to find her voice, though it came out as barely more than a whisper. You've been subsidizing their rent? For 3 years? Not just the rent, I replied, clicking through additional financial records. Home improvements, landscaping, the security system, premium internet service, the children's playground equipment in the backyard. Most of what you've attributed to good luck or excellent rental management has actually been my investment in creating a comfortable home for my family. Patricia's face had gone pale as she processed the implications of what I was revealing. If you own the properties, why have you been living here like hired help? Why didn't you tell us who you were? The question hung in the air, carrying all the weight of 3 years of misunderstanding and misplaced assumptions. I closed the laptop and looked directly at Patricia, seeing her clearly for perhaps the first time since we had met. Because I wanted to understand what kind of people my son had married into, I said quietly. I wanted to see how you would treat someone you thought had nothing to offer except domestic labor. I wanted to know if my family valued me for who I am, or only for what I could provide them. The weight of my words settled over the dining room, like a heavy blanket, stifling the comfortable assumptions that had governed our relationships for 3 years. David's face showed a mixture of shock and dawning embarrassment as he began to understand the implications of how they had treated me, while Jessica looked stricken by the realization that her complaints about my presence had been directed toward someone who had been quietly ensuring their financial security. Patricia recovered first, her business instincts kicking in as she tried to process the dramatic shift in power dynamics that my revelation had created. Margaret, she said, her voice carefully controlled. This is quite a shock for all of us. If you've been managing these properties all along, why maintain the pretense? Why not simply tell us the truth from the beginning? I stood up and walked to the kitchen window, looking out at the street where several of my neighbors were returning home from work. People who knew me only as David's helpful mother, but who were actually my tenants living in properties I had designed and developed. The view reminded me of why I had originally fallen in love with this community. The careful balance of privacy and connection. The architectural harmony that Robert and I had worked so hard to achieve. When Robert died, I explained, turning back to face my family, I could have continued living in our main house in West Hartford. It's larger, more luxurious, everything you might expect from someone who developed successful real estate projects. But after 42 years of marriage, that house felt empty and cold. When David invited me to move in with your family, it seemed like an opportunity to be part of something meaningful again. David's expression had shifted from shock to something that looked like guilt mixed with confusion. But Mom, why didn't you just tell us you owned the house? Why go through the whole rental arrangement? Because I wanted you to feel independent and successful, I replied, You and Jessica were so proud of finding a beautiful rental property in an exclusive neighborhood, so excited about providing your children with this lifestyle. If you had known I owned the house, it would have felt like charity rather than achievement. Amanda, who had been unusually quiet during this exchange, finally spoke up with a voice that carried a note of calculating interest. If you own all the properties in Willowbrook Heights, what's the total value of your real estate portfolio? The question revealed everything I needed to know about Amanda's priorities and what this revelation meant to her. Rather than expressing concern about family relationships or wondering why I had felt the need to hide my identity, her immediate interest was in quantifying my net worth and understanding what financial opportunities my ownership might represent. I returned to my laptop and opened a different set of files, displaying current property valuations and market assessments that showed the comprehensive scope of my real estate holdings. The Willowbrook Heights development alone was valued at just over $57 million, with individual properties ranging from $800,000 to $2 million depending on size and location. Patricia leaned forward to study the financial documents, her expression showing the kind of intense focus she typically reserved for important business matters. These valuations, she said carefully, they represent current market conditions? I nodded, scrolling through additional pages that showed comparable sales data and recent appraisals. The property values have remained stable even during economic downturns, which was always one of our primary goals in developing this community. Quality construction, careful tenant selection, and ongoing maintenance investments have protected everyone's equity. Jessica had been silent throughout most of this conversation, but now she spoke with a voice that carried a note of hurt and confusion. Margaret, I don't understand why you felt you needed to test us. If you had concerns about how we treated you, why not just talk to us directly instead of creating this elaborate deception? The question struck at the heart of what had become an increasingly painful situation over the past 3 years. I looked at Jessica, seeing her genuine confusion and recognizing that from her perspective, my behavior might seem manipulative or unnecessarily complicated. It wasn't meant to be a test initially, I said carefully. When I first moved in, I simply didn't mention my financial situation because it didn't seem relevant to our family relationships. But as time passed and I heard how you talked about me, how you described my role in your household, I began to understand that my perceived economic status was affecting how you valued my contributions. David ran his hands through his hair, a gesture I remembered from his childhood when he was processing difficult information. What do you mean, how we talked about you? I had been dreading this part of the conversation, the moment when I would have to confront my family with the painful reality of how they had been describing me to others. But after 3 years of enduring their casual dismissal and condescending assumptions, I felt entitled to honesty about the impact of their words and attitudes. At the block party 3 days ago, I said, looking directly at David, you told Stephen Mitchell that I had become quite the housekeeper, that having me live with you was saving money on hiring professional help. You described me as someone who was good with organization and cleaning, as if those were my primary qualifications for being part of your family. David's face flushed with embarrassment as he remembered the conversation, clearly recognizing how his words must have sounded from my perspective. Mom, I didn't mean it that way. I was just trying to explain to the neighbors why our living arrangement worked so well for everyone. And Jessica, I continued, turning to address my daughter-in-law directly. Yesterday afternoon, you told your mother and sister that having me in your house felt awkward when you were trying to maintain a certain image in this neighborhood. You said that having your mother-in-law doing housework sent the wrong message about your financial situation. Jessica's eyes filled with tears as she processed what I was saying, clearly understanding for the first time how deeply her words had hurt me. I wasn't talking about you personally, she said weakly. I was talking about the situation, about how it might look to other people. But I am the situation, Jessica. When you complain about how having me in your house affects your image, you're complaining about me. When you worry about what messages my presence sends to your neighbors, You're treating me as an embarrassment to be managed rather than a family member to be valued." Patricia had been listening to this exchange with growing agitation, her business instincts clearly struggling with the emotional complexity of family dynamics. "Margaret," she said firmly, "I think we need to focus on practical matters rather than rehashing past conversations that were taken out of context. Now that we understand your financial situation, what are your intentions regarding the property ownership?" The question revealed Patricia's priorities with crystal clarity. Rather than addressing the family relationships that had been damaged by years of condescending treatment, she wanted to move immediately to discussions about how my wealth might benefit her daughter's family. The transition from dismissing me as an inconvenient burden to treating me as a valuable resource was so rapid and transparent that it would have been comical if it weren't so insulting. "My intentions," I said slowly, "will depend largely on how this family chooses to move forward with our relationships. For 3 years, I've been subsidizing your lifestyle while being treated as hired help. I've been quietly ensuring your financial security while listening to conversations about how my presence in your lives is an embarrassment that needs to be managed." Amanda's eyes had taken on the calculating gleam that I was beginning to recognize as her response to potential business opportunities. "But surely, now that everything is out in the open, we can establish a more appropriate family dynamic. You're obviously a sophisticated businesswoman, and we clearly didn't understand the extent of your accomplishments." The rapid shift in Amanda's tone and attitude was breathtaking in its shamelessness. 3 days ago, she had been planning to manipulate an anonymous elderly property owner into selling valuable real estate below market value. Now that she knew the property owner was sitting in the same room, she was immediately repositioning herself as someone who recognized and appreciated my business sophistication. "I'm curious, Amanda," I said, meeting her eyes directly. "What exactly has changed about your perception of me between this morning and this evening?" "This morning, you thought I would be useful for gathering intelligence about neighbors, so you could approach an elderly property owner with investment schemes. Tonight, you're describing me as a sophisticated businesswoman. What's different?" Amanda's face flushed as she realized how transparent her change in attitude appeared. "I think we all had misconceptions about your background and experience," she said carefully. "Now that we have better information, obviously our understanding has evolved." The euphemistic language Amanda used to describe her complete reversal of opinion would have been amusing if it weren't so representative of how quickly people's attitudes could change when they discovered someone had wealth and power. This morning, I had been a useful tool for gathering information. Tonight, I was someone whose sophistication and business experience deserved recognition and respect. David had been quiet during this exchange, his expression showing the internal struggle of someone trying to reconcile years of assumptions with dramatically new information. "Mom," he said finally, "I need to ask you something directly. Are you angry with us? Are you planning to, I don't know, kick us out or change our rental arrangement because of how we've treated you?" The vulnerability in David's voice reminded me that despite everything that had happened, he was still my son, and his question reflected genuine concern about his family's security rather than just financial opportunism. But it also revealed that even now, his primary worry was about practical consequences rather than the relationship damage that had been done. "I'm not angry, David," I said truthfully. "I'm disappointed. For 3 years, I've watched you describe me to neighbors as household help while living in a house I provided for you at below-market rent. I've listened to Jessica's family plan investment schemes based on assumptions about vulnerable elderly women while sitting at a table in my own property. I've been treated as an inconvenience to be managed rather than a mother and grandmother to be cherished." The emotional weight of 3 years of accumulated hurt was finally finding expression, and I could see its impact on my family's faces. David looked stricken, Jessica was crying quietly, and even Patricia seemed to be processing the implications of how their attitudes and assumptions had affected our relationships. "But anger isn't the right word for what I'm feeling," I continued. What I'm feeling is clarity about what our relationships have actually been based on, and what I want them to be based on going forward. Jessica wiped her eyes and looked at me with an expression that seemed genuinely remorseful. Margaret, I'm so sorry. I had no idea that our conversations were hurting you. I never meant to make you feel unwelcome or unappreciated. The apology seemed sincere, but it also revealed the fundamental problem that had created this situation. Jessica hadn't intended to hurt me, but she also hadn't considered that her words and attitudes might have an impact on someone she viewed as occupying a subordinate position in her household. The hurt hadn't been intentional, but it had been thoughtless and systematic. I appreciate the apology, Jessica, I said gently. But I need you to understand that the problem isn't just about specific conversations or comments. The problem is about how you've all been thinking about me and my role in your lives. When you think of me as someone who should be grateful for housing and who contributes primarily through domestic labor, it affects every interaction we have. Patricia had been listening to this exchange with visible impatience, clearly wanting to move past emotional discussions and into practical planning. Margaret, she said briskly, I think we can all agree that there have been misunderstandings on all sides. The important thing now is to establish clear expectations and arrangements that work for everyone involved. The business-like tone Patricia was using suggested that she viewed this family crisis as a negotiation problem to be solved rather than a relationship issue that needed healing. Her focus on establishing arrangements that worked for everyone involved revealed her assumption that my primary concern would be managing family dynamics in ways that benefited her daughter's household. What kind of arrangements did you have in mind, Patricia? I asked, curious to hear how she thought this situation should be resolved. Patricia straightened in her chair, assuming the authoritative posture she used when taking charge of complicated situations. Obviously, the current living arrangement isn't working for anyone. You need your independence and privacy, and David's family needs to establish their own household management systems without relying on family members for domestic support. The way she framed the situation made it sound as if the current arrangement had been failing everyone equally, rather than acknowledging that I had been providing substantial financial and practical support while being treated as hired help. Her suggestion that I needed independence and privacy ignored the fact that I had been living in my own property while being made to feel like an unwelcome guest. What Patricia was really suggesting, I realized, was a return to the previous plan of finding me alternative housing so that David and Jessica could continue living in my property without the complications of having me present. The revelation of my wealth had changed the family dynamics, but it hadn't changed Patricia's fundamental goal of removing me from her daughter's household. I think there might be better solutions than the ones you're suggesting, Patricia, I said calmly. Since I own this house and 46 others in this neighborhood, I have options that don't require me to relocate or establish independence somewhere else. The reminder of my property ownership shifted the power dynamic in the room, immediately and dramatically. Patricia's confident tone faltered as she processed the implications of trying to make housing arrangements for someone who controlled more real estate than anyone else in the conversation. Amanda leaned forward with renewed interest, clearly recognizing that the conversation had moved into territory that could affect her business opportunities. What kind of options are you considering? She asked, her voice carrying the careful neutrality of someone who didn't want to say anything that might jeopardize potential advantages. I looked around the dining room table at my family, seeing them, clearly for perhaps the first time since this complicated arrangement had begun 3 years earlier. David, the son I loved but who had reduced my contributions to household management. Jessica, the daughter-in-law who had worried about how my presence affected her social image. Patricia, the business-minded mother-in-law who wanted to manage family relationships like corporate negotiations. Amanda, the opportunistic sister-in-law who saw family revelations primarily as potential profit opportunities. One option, I said slowly, is to continue the current arrangement with some significant modifications. You could remain in this house, but at fair market rent and with a clear understanding that I'm your landlord rather than your unpaid domestic help." David's face showed immediate concern about the financial implications of paying market rate rent, which would likely double or triple their current housing costs. "We couldn't afford market rate rent in this neighborhood," he said honestly. "Our salaries wouldn't cover that kind of expense plus all our other costs." I nodded, appreciating his honesty about their financial limitations. "That's true, which brings us to option 2. I could gift this house to you outright, transferring ownership so that you'd have true independence and wouldn't need to worry about rent payments at all." The family's expressions brightened immediately at the mention of receiving a house worth over $900,000 as a gift, though I noticed that no one seemed to be considering what such generosity might cost me or what I might want in return for such a substantial gift. "Option 3, I continued, "is that you find alternative housing arrangements that fit your actual budget, and I reclaim this property for other purposes. I have a waiting list of potential tenants who would pay market rate rent and treat me with the respect due to their landlord." The third option clearly alarmed everyone at the table, representing the loss of their subsidized lifestyle and their comfortable home in an exclusive neighborhood. Patricia's expression had become sharp and calculating as she processed the implications of the various choices I was presenting. "What would you want in return for option 2? Patricia asked directly. "If you're considering gifting them the house, what would your expectations be regarding family relationships and ongoing arrangements?" The question revealed Patricia's transactional approach to family dynamics, her assumption that significant financial gifts would come with strings attached and obligations that would need to be negotiated and managed. While she wasn't wrong, that gifting a house worth nearly $1 million would create new relationship dynamics. Her approach treated love and generosity as business deals to be structured, rather than expressions of family connection. "What I would want, Patricia, is something that money can't buy and contracts can't guarantee. I would want to be valued as a family member rather than evaluated as household help. I would want my contributions to be appreciated rather than taken for granted. I would want to be included in family decisions rather than having plans made about my life without consulting me." The emotional nature of my requirements seemed to frustrate Patricia, who was clearly more comfortable with concrete terms and measurable obligations. "Those are rather subjective criteria," she said carefully. "How would anyone know whether they were meeting your expectations for appreciation and inclusion?" The question revealed everything I needed to understand about how Patricia viewed relationships and what she thought motivated people's behavior toward each other. She couldn't imagine valuing someone for their intrinsic worth rather than for their instrumental utility, so she assumed that my requests for respect and inclusion were negotiating positions rather than expressions of basic human needs. I think, Patricia, that people who genuinely value and appreciate someone don't need specific criteria to guide their behavior. It comes naturally from seeing that person as worthy of consideration and care. The conversation was interrupted by Emma and Ryan, who had been playing quietly in the living room, but had apparently grown tired of adult discussions that didn't include them. Emma climbed into my lap while Ryan settled on the floor beside my chair, both children seeking the comfortable connection they had always found with their grandmother. "Are you moving away, Grandma Maggie?" Emma asked, her young voice carrying the direct concern that children express when they sense that adult conversations might affect their security and happiness. The question from my granddaughter crystallized everything that was at stake in this family crisis. Emma and Ryan had never seen me as household help or domestic support. They had simply known me as the grandmother who read them bedtime stories, helped with homework, and made their favorite snacks. Their relationships with me had been uncomplicated by the social and economic considerations that had affected the adult family dynamics. "I'm not planning to move away, sweetheart," I said, stroking Emma's hair while meeting David's eyes across the table. "But some things about our family arrangements might need to change so that everyone feels respected and valued." Ryan looked up at me with the serious expression he wore when trying to understand adult complexities. "Does that mean Mommy and Daddy won't live here anymore?" The innocent questions from my grandchildren had introduced a new element into our family discussion, reminding everyone that the choices we made would affect more than just adult pride and financial arrangements. Emma and Ryan had never asked whether their grandmother was wealthy or poor, whether she owned their house or rented a room. They had simply enjoyed having her present in their daily lives. "That will depend on what Mommy and Daddy decide they want our family to look like going forward," I said gently, knowing that the children deserved honest answers, even if those answers were complicated. David reached across the table and took my free hand, his expression showing a mixture of regret and determination. "Mom, I need to say something. I've been thinking about everything you've told us tonight, and I realize that I've been taking you for granted in ways that were completely unfair and hurtful. The direct acknowledgement from my son carried more weight than all of Patricia's strategic planning or Amanda's business calculations." David was finally seeing me clearly, recognizing the gap between how he had been treating me and how he wanted to treat someone he loved. "I don't want you to feel like you need to give us a house or change our rental arrangements to prove anything," David continued. "What I want is to figure out how we can be a real family, one where everyone feels valued and respected for who they are, rather than what they can provide." Jessica nodded through her tears, reaching out to take my other hand. "I've been horrible, Margaret. I've been so worried about what other people thought of our family that I lost sight of what actually mattered. I don't want you to move away, and I don't want you to feel like you have to buy our love or respect with real estate gifts." The emotional honesty from David and Jessica felt genuine in a way that the strategic discussions and business calculations had not. But I also knew that good intentions and heartfelt apologies wouldn't automatically solve 3 years of accumulated hurt and misunderstanding. "I appreciate what you're both saying," I replied carefully, "but I need you to understand that rebuilding trust and respect in our relationships will take time and consistent behavior, not just good intentions and apologies." Patricia had been listening to this exchange with visible impatience, clearly uncomfortable with the emotional direction the conversation had taken. While family healing and relationship repair were important goals, her practical instincts were focused on securing advantages and managing outcomes rather than processing feelings and building connection. "The question everyone needs to consider," Patricia interjected, "is what arrangements will actually work for this family going forward. Emotional reconciliation is important, but it needs to be supported by practical structures that set everyone up for success." Amanda nodded in agreement with her mother's pragmatic approach. "Plus, there are broader considerations about property management and investment strategies that should be part of any long-term planning." The return to business discussions reminded me that while David and Jessica might be genuinely committed to changing how they approached our relationship, Patricia and Amanda were still primarily focused on how my wealth could benefit their family's financial situation. Their interest in practical arrangements and investment strategies revealed their continued view of me as a resource to be managed, rather than a person to be valued. "I think," I said slowly, "that before we discuss property arrangements or investment strategies, we need to establish whether this family is committed to treating me as an equal member, rather than as someone whose primary value lies in what I can provide for others." The challenge in my words was deliberate and direct, forcing everyone at the table to confront the fundamental question that would determine our future relationships. Were they interested in having Margaret Collins as a treasured mother, grandmother, and family member? Or were they primarily interested in having access to Margaret Collins' real estate portfolio and financial resources? The answer to that question would determine everything that happened next. The morning after our confrontational family meeting brought an unusual stillness to the house on Maple Street. David had called in sick to work, something he rarely did, while Jessica had rearranged her schedule to work from home. The children sensed the tension and spoke in whispers, unsure of what the previous evening's intense adult conversations meant for their daily routines. I moved through the house with a new sense of purpose, no longer the accommodating family member trying to avoid conflict, but a woman who had finally decided to live authentically regardless of the consequences. I was preparing breakfast when my phone rang with a call from Maria Santos, my property manager, who had been handling the operational details of Willowbrook Heights for the past 15 years. Her timing was perfect, as if the universe had conspired to provide me with the opportunity to demonstrate exactly how much control I actually wielded over this community that my family was only beginning to understand. "Mrs. Collins," Maria said, her voice carrying the professional efficiency that had made her invaluable to my business operations, "I have the quarterly reports ready for your review, and there are several items that need your immediate attention. The Henderson property at 41 Maple Street has requested permission to install solar panels, and the Mitchell family wants to extend their back deck. Both modifications require your approval as the primary developer." I smiled as I realized that Maria was discussing two of my neighbors who had no idea their renovation requests were being reviewed by the woman they knew as David's helpful mother. The Henderson property belonged to Patricia's friends, the ones she had mentioned as potential sources of information about the mysterious property owner. The Mitchell property was Caroline's house, the woman who had spent 3 years treating me like event staff at community gatherings. "Approve both requests," I told Maria, "but I want to schedule a site visit to review the work personally. I think it's time I took a more hands-on approach to property management in this community." David overheard my conversation and looked up from his coffee with curious confusion. "Who was that, Mom? It sounded like you were discussing neighborhood renovation projects." "That was my property manager," I replied, ending the call and turning to face my son directly. "She handles the day-to-day operations for all my properties, but major decisions still require my personal approval. Your neighbors, Caroline Mitchell, and the Henderson family have requested modifications to their homes that I need to review." The casual way I discussed approving or denying renovation requests for people David considered important community members clearly demonstrated the extent of my authority in ways that property deeds and financial documents couldn't fully convey. He was beginning to understand that his mother wasn't just wealthy in abstract terms, but that she actively controlled the living situations of everyone he knew in Willowbrook Heights. Jessica emerged from the bedroom where she had been setting up her laptop for a day of remote work, her expression showing the strain of processing the previous evening's revelations. She moved carefully around the kitchen, as if uncertain about how to interact with someone she was only now beginning to understand. "Margaret," she said hesitantly, "I keep thinking about everything you told us last night. I'm trying to understand why you chose to handle things this way, instead of just being open about your situation from the beginning." The question was fair, though it revealed Jessica's continued difficulty in grasping the emotional complexities that had motivated my choices. From her perspective, concealing wealth and property ownership seemed unnecessarily complicated when openness might have prevented misunderstandings and hurt feelings. I poured coffee for both David and Jessica before settling at the kitchen table with them, recognizing that this conversation would be crucial for determining whether our family relationships could be rebuilt on a foundation of mutual respect and understanding. When Robert died, I explained, I had to make some difficult decisions about how I wanted to live the rest of my life. I could have remained in our large house in West Hartford, surrounded by reminders of our marriage and maintaining the lifestyle of a wealthy widow. But that felt empty and lonely, disconnected from the things that actually mattered to me. David nodded thoughtfully, beginning to understand the emotional context that had shaped my choices. "So when I invited you to move in with us, you saw it as an opportunity for something different." "Exactly. You offered me the chance to be part of a young family's daily life, to be useful and needed in ways that had nothing to do with money or property ownership. I wanted to know if I could find meaning and connection through relationships rather than through wealth and social status." Jessica's expression showed growing comprehension mixed with regret. "But we turned you into household help instead of treating you as family. We made you feel like your value was in what you could do for us rather than who you were." The acknowledgement was painful but necessary. and I appreciated Jessica's willingness to confront the reality of how our relationships had developed. The problem wasn't that they had accepted my help with household tasks, but that they had reduced my identity to those tasks while dismissing other aspects of who I was. The situation became more complicated over time, I continued. The longer I maintained the facade, the more I learned about how people treated those they perceived as economically vulnerable. Caroline Mitchell's condescending thanks at community events, Patricia's suggestions that I needed to find appropriate housing for someone my age, Amanda's assumptions about manipulating elderly property owners. All of these attitudes were directed towards someone they thought couldn't affect their lives in return. David's face showed embarrassment as he processed the implications of how community members had been treating his mother. I never realized that people were being condescending to you. I thought everyone liked and respected you. They liked me fine as long as I stayed in the role they had assigned to me, I replied. Helpful, grateful, invisible when necessary, useful when needed. But the moment I showed any independence or made decisions they didn't understand, the facade of respect disappeared very quickly. My phone buzzed with another call, this time from Detective Frank Morrison, a longtime friend who occasionally consulted with me on community safety issues. His timing provided another opportunity to demonstrate the extent of my connections and influence in ways that my family was only beginning to appreciate. "Margaret," Frank said, his familiar voice carrying the easy tone of someone who had worked with me for years. "I wanted to give you a heads up about some suspicious activity that's been reported in your neighborhood. We've had some complaints about people asking questions about property ownership and taking photos of houses without permission." I glanced at Amanda, who was just entering the kitchen and who had spent considerable time over the past week researching property ownership and developing investment strategies. Her face went pale as she realized that her information-gathering activities might have attracted official attention. "What kind of questions were people asking?" I inquired, keeping my voice neutral while watching Amanda's increasingly uncomfortable expression. Residents reported strangers approaching them with questions about who owns their houses, whether properties might be for sale, and details about the neighborhood's development history. Some people felt like they were being surveilled or investigated, which made them nervous enough to call us. Amanda sat down heavily at the kitchen table, clearly understanding that her research activities had been noticed and reported by suspicious neighbors who were concerned about potential criminal activity or investment scams targeting their community. "I appreciate the information, Frank," I said. "I'll make sure to be extra vigilant about any unusual activity in the area. If you need any additional information about the neighborhood or its residents, please let me know." After ending the call, I looked directly at Amanda, whose face had gone from pale to flushed as she processed the implications of what she had just heard. "The investment research you were conducting appears to have alarmed several neighbors enough that they contacted the police about suspicious activity." Amanda's voice came out as barely more than a whisper. "I was just trying to gather information about potential opportunities. I never meant to frighten anyone or create problems." The fact that residents had been concerned enough about Amanda's activities to contact law enforcement demonstrated how seriously they took threats to their community's security and privacy. What she had viewed as harmless business research had been perceived by others as potentially predatory behavior that needed official investigation. "This is exactly why I maintained privacy about my property ownership," I explained to my family. "When people don't know who controls their housing security, they're naturally suspicious of anyone who seems to be investigating or evaluating their homes." Amanda's research created exactly the kind of anxiety and uncertainty that good property management tries to avoid. Patricia arrived at that moment, letting herself in through the front door with her usual assumption of welcome, but stopping short when she saw the serious expressions around the kitchen table. The dynamic in the room had shifted dramatically. From the previous evening, with Amanda looking chastened, David and Jessica appearing thoughtful and remorseful, and me clearly occupying a position of authority that Patricia hadn't expected. "I hope I'm not interrupting anything important," Patricia said, though her tone suggested she was prepared to interrupt regardless of what was happening. Actually, I replied, your timing is perfect. We were just discussing some of the complications that can arise when people research property ownership without understanding the potential consequences of their activities. Patricia's expression showed immediate concern as she processed the implications of what I was saying. Has there been some kind of problem with Amanda's investment research? Before I could respond, my phone rang again, this time displaying the number for Judge Helen Crawford, who had been handling my legal affairs and who often called to discuss community issues that required judicial input. Her call provided yet another demonstration of the professional connections and legal authority that my family was only beginning to understand. Margaret, Helen said, her voice carrying the formal tone she used for official business, I've been reviewing the documentation you sent regarding potential property transfers in the Willowbrook Heights development. Before I can approve any significant changes to ownership structures, I need to verify that all parties understand the legal and financial implications of the proposed arrangements. I looked around the kitchen table at my family, who were listening to my side of a conversation about property transfers that could affect their housing security and financial future. Their expressions showed growing realization that decisions about their lives were being made at levels of authority and legal complexity they hadn't previously understood. Judge Crawford, I said, keeping my voice professional despite the family drama unfolding around me. I think we need to schedule a formal meeting to discuss all options before making any final decisions. The situation has become more complicated than originally anticipated. Helen's tone became more concerned. Are we dealing with family disputes or legal challenges that might affect the proposed transfers? Both, I replied honestly. There are relationship issues that need to be resolved before any property transfers can be finalized, and there may be some complications regarding previous research activities that have attracted law enforcement attention. The mention of law enforcement clearly alarmed Patricia, whose business instincts made her immediately concerned about anything that might create legal problems or public scrutiny. Amanda looked like she might be sick, realizing that her investment schemes had potentially created legal complications that could affect everyone involved. Let me arrange a comprehensive meeting for early next week, Helen said. I'll prepare documentation for all possible scenarios, and we can determine the best path forward based on everyone's actual preferences rather than assumptions or pressure from outside parties. After ending the call, I looked around the kitchen table at my family, seeing their faces clearly in the morning light streaming through the windows. David, genuinely remorseful and trying to understand how to rebuild our relationship. Jessica, embarrassed by her previous attitudes but committed to making changes. Amanda, chastened by the realization that her business schemes had created serious complications. Patricia, calculating rapidly as she tried to determine how to manage a situation that had moved far beyond her control. The judge who just called has been handling my legal affairs for 15 years, I explained to them. She's preparing documentation for potential property transfers, but she's also concerned about some of the complications that have arisen from recent research activities and family conflicts. Patricia's expression became sharp and focused. What kind of legal complications are we discussing? Surely Amanda's research couldn't have created serious problems. Detective Morrison's call suggested that neighbors were concerned enough about strangers asking questions about property ownership to contact the police, I replied. When law enforcement starts investigating suspicious activity in a community, it can create complications for everyone involved, especially if there are questions about intent or potential fraud. Amanda finally found her voice, though it carried a note of panic. I never intended to commit fraud or do anything illegal. I was just trying to identify investment opportunities. The problem, Amanda, is that approaching residents with questions about property ownership while planning to contact the owner with manipulative investment proposals could be construed as attempted fraud or elder abuse, especially given your assumptions about the owner being a vulnerable elderly woman. The legal terminology seemed to frighten Amanda even more, as she began to understand that her business schemes might have crossed lines she hadn't recognized. What she had viewed as aggressive but legitimate business tactics could potentially be interpreted as predatory behavior targeting vulnerable populations. Patricia's business instincts kicked in as she tried to assess the legal risks and determine how to minimize potential consequences. What would need to happen to resolve these complications without creating ongoing problems? That depends largely on what this family decides about our relationships going forward, I replied. Judge Crawford is preparing documentation for several different scenarios, but the legal structures will depend on whether we can establish trust and mutual respect, or whether we need formal contracts and protective arrangements. David looked confused by the distinction I was making between family, relationships, and legal protections. What's the difference between those two approaches? When family members trust and respect each other, I explained, property transfers and financial arrangements can be handled informally, based on love and mutual consideration. When family members view each other primarily as sources of financial advantage, legal protections become necessary to prevent exploitation and abuse. The words hung in the air as everyone processed their implications. I was offering them a choice between two fundamentally different approaches to our future relationships. They could demonstrate genuine love and respect, earning the informal generosity that comes with being treasured family members, or they could continue approaching me as a resource to be managed, in which case formal legal protections would govern all our interactions. Jessica was the first to understand what I was really asking. You want to know whether we love you for who you are, or whether we're interested in you primarily because of your wealth and property ownership. Exactly. And your behavior over the next few weeks will demonstrate the answer to that question more clearly than any promises or apologies. You might make today. Emma and Ryan chose that moment to wander into the kitchen, their young faces showing concern about the serious adult conversations that had been dominating their home for the past day. Emma climbed into my lap while Ryan settled beside my chair, both children seeking the comfort they had always found with their grandmother. Are you sad, Grandma Maggie? Emma asked, her young voice carrying the direct concern that children express when they sense adult unhappiness. The question from my granddaughter reminded everyone that the choices we made would affect more than just adult pride and financial arrangements. Emma and Ryan had always known me simply as the grandmother who loved them unconditionally, who read bedtime stories and helped with homework regardless of rent payments or property ownership. I'm not sad, sweetheart, I said, stroking Emma's hair while meeting David's eyes across the table. I'm just making sure that all the grown-ups in our family understand how to treat each other with kindness and respect. Ryan looked up at me with the serious expression he wore when trying to understand adult complexities. Will you still live with us and make pancakes on Saturday mornings? The innocent question cut through all the complicated discussions about property ownership and legal arrangements, focusing on what actually mattered to the children who had never seen me as anything other than their beloved grandmother. That will depend on whether the grown-ups can figure out how to be a real family, I said gently, knowing that Emma and Ryan deserved honest answers, even if those answers carried emotional weight. David reached across the table and covered my free hand with his. Mom, I want you to know that regardless of anything else that happens, you're not just welcome in our family. You're essential to who we are. Emma and Ryan adore you. Jessica and I need your wisdom and support, and I can't imagine our lives without you in them. The words carried genuine emotion, but I had learned to distinguish between heartfelt sentiment and sustained behavioral change. David's declaration was meaningful, but it would need to be supported by consistent actions over time, rather than just good intentions expressed during moments of crisis. I appreciate that, David, I replied carefully. But I need you to understand, that feeling essential to your family and being treated as essential are different things. For 3 years, you've described me to neighbors as household help, while I've been quietly ensuring your financial security and emotional support. Jessica wiped tears from her eyes as she processed the full implications of how they had been treating me. We've been taking you for granted in ways that were completely unfair and hurtful. You've been giving us everything while we've been giving. You nothing in return except a place to sleep and occasional thanks for domestic labor." The acknowledgement was painful but accurate, and I appreciated Jessica's willingness to confront the reality of our family dynamics without making excuses or deflecting responsibility. Patricia had been listening to this exchange with growing impatience, clearly uncomfortable with emotional processing when practical matters needed to be resolved. "While relationship healing is important," she interjected, "we need to make some concrete decisions about housing arrangements and property management that will work for everyone involved." The interruption reminded me that while David and Jessica might be genuinely committed to changing how they approached our relationship, Patricia remained focused on managing outcomes rather than building connections. Her practical instincts were aimed at securing advantages for her daughter's family, rather than understanding the emotional needs that had motivated my choices. "Actually, Patricia," I said, standing up from the table while Emma remained in my lap, "the practical arrangements will follow naturally from the relationship decisions. If this family demonstrates genuine love and respect over time, the practical matters will resolve themselves generously. If they continue to view me primarily as a resource to be managed, then formal legal arrangements will protect everyone's interests." Amanda looked up from her worried contemplation of potential legal problems. "What would we need to do to demonstrate genuine love and respect? What specific behaviors would show that we value you as family, rather than as a financial resource?" The question revealed Amanda's continued transactional approach to relationships. Her assumption that love and respect could be performed through specific behaviors, rather than expressed through authentic emotional connection. She was looking for a checklist of required actions rather than understanding the fundamental attitude change that would make such actions unnecessary. "Amanda," I replied gently, "people who genuinely love and respect someone don't need instructions about how to demonstrate those feelings. It comes naturally from seeing that person as valuable for their own sake, rather than for what they can provide." The conversation was interrupted by a knock at the front door, followed by the sound of someone entering without waiting for permission. Caroline Mitchell's voice carried through the house as she called out her usual greeting, clearly expecting to find me available for whatever community task or favor she had in mind. "Margaret," Caroline called, her tone carrying the authority of someone accustomed to having her requests fulfilled promptly. "I hope you have a few minutes to discuss the summer garden tour planning. We need someone to coordinate the refreshment stations, and you've always been so reliable with that kind of detail work." The timing of Caroline's arrival was perfect, providing an immediate opportunity to demonstrate the dramatic shift in power dynamics that my family was only beginning to understand. Caroline entered the kitchen expecting to find me in my usual role as helpful community volunteer, but instead found herself facing a woman who was no longer hiding her true position in the neighborhood hierarchy. "Actually, Caroline," I said, remaining seated at the table with Emma in my lap, "I think we need to discuss some changes in how community events are organized and managed in Willowbrook Heights." Caroline's expression showed surprise at my failure to immediately accommodate her request, clearly not expecting resistance or alternative suggestions from someone she had always been able to direct and manage. "What kind of changes?" she asked, her tone carrying a note of impatience that suggested she wasn't interested in lengthy discussions when simple compliance would be more efficient. "I think it's time for you to meet the person who actually makes decisions about community policies and event planning in this neighborhood," I replied, meeting her eyes directly. "Caroline Mitchell, I'd like you to meet Margaret Collins, the owner and developer of Willowbrook Heights." The silence that followed was complete and profound. Caroline's face went through a series of expressions as she processed what I had just said, her mind clearly struggling to reconcile years of assumptions with the dramatically new information I had just provided. "I don't understand," Caroline said weakly. "You're David's mother. You help with household tasks and community events. You're not a property developer. I'm both, Caroline. I've been David's mother and your neighbor for 3 years, during which time I've also been the person who owns your house, approves your renovation requests, and funds the community improvements you've been enjoying." Caroline sank into an empty chair at the kitchen table, Her usual confidence and authority completely evaporated as she tried to process the implications of what she was hearing. For 3 years, she had been treating the owner of her house like unpaid event staff, offering patronizing thanks for services she had never realized were provided by someone who could evict her with 30 days' notice. "The garden tour planning you mentioned," I continued, "will need to be coordinated through my property management company going forward. Community events that use common areas require approval from the property owner, and refreshment stations need permits for commercial activity on private property." The bureaucratic language I was using served a specific purpose, demonstrating that Caroline's casual assumption of authority over community events had no legal foundation. She had been organizing activities on property she didn't own, making decisions about spaces she had no right to control, and directing people who had no obligation to follow her instructions. David and Jessica watched this interaction with fascination, seeing their neighbor's power and confidence completely undermined by the revelation of my true position. Caroline Mitchell, who had been the unofficial queen of Willowbrook Heights social hierarchy, was suddenly revealed as just another tenant who existed at the discretion of someone she had been dismissing and patronizing. "I think I need to go home and process this information," Caroline said weakly, standing up from the table with none of her usual commanding presence. "Perhaps we could discuss community event planning at another time, when I've had a chance to understand the new circumstances." "Of course, Caroline. My property manager will be in touch about procedures for requesting approval for future community activities. She'll also provide you with updated contact information for addressing any concerns about neighborhood policies or services." After Caroline left, clearly shaken by the encounter, my family sat in stunned silence as they processed what they had just witnessed. The neighbor who had been treating me like hired help for 3 years had just learned that I controlled her housing security and could approve or deny her community activities with a single phone call. Patricia was the first to find her voice, though it carried a note of uncertainty that hadn't been present in any of our previous conversations. "Margaret, how many people in this neighborhood have no idea who you really are?" "Everyone," I replied simply. "Caroline, the Hendersons, Dr. Kim, Tom Bradley, all 47 families in Willowbrook Heights interact with me as David's helpful mother, rather than as their landlord and community developer." The scope of my concealed identity seemed to overwhelm them as they began to understand that I had been living unrecognized among dozens of people whose lives I could dramatically affect with simple business decisions. Every neighbor who had treated me as invisible domestic help was actually speaking to someone who controlled their rent increases, their renovation permissions, and their community policies. Amanda's business instincts finally grasped the full implications of what she had been planning. "I was going to approach you about investing in properties you already owned, while sitting in a house you own, discussing strategies for manipulating a property owner who was sitting at the same table with me." The absurdity of Amanda's investment scheme would have been comical if it hadn't revealed such profound assumptions about older women and their business capabilities. She had constructed elaborate plans for taking advantage of someone she assumed would be vulnerable to pressure and flattery, never considering that the property owner might be someone who had chosen anonymity as a strategic business decision. My phone rang again, this time showing Maria Santos's number with what I suspected would be another routine business matter that would further demonstrate the extent of my authority and connections. Her timing continued to be perfect for illustrating the invisible infrastructure that supported my neighbors' comfortable lives. "Mrs. Collins," Maria said, "I have the Henderson family on the other line requesting permission to replace their roof. They mentioned that their insurance company requires written approval from the property owner for major repairs. Should I have them submit a formal application?" "Please connect me directly to Mr. Henderson," I said, watching my family's expressions as they realized I was about to have a business conversation with Patricia's friends who had no idea they were speaking to David's mother. The call transfer took only a moment, and then I heard Michael Henderson's voice, professional and slightly deferential as he addressed someone he assumed was a remote property manager or business representative. "This is Margaret Collins," I said, using my most professional tone. "I understand you need approval for roof replacement on your property at 41 Maple Street." "Yes, Ms. Collins," Michael replied, clearly not recognizing my voice or making any connection to the woman he knew as his neighbor's helpful mother. "Our insurance company requires written authorization from the property owner for claims over $50,000. We hope this won't delay the repair process. I have your file in front of me, Mr. Henderson. The roof replacement is approved, and I'll have my property manager send the necessary documentation to your insurance company today. Is there anything else you need regarding this repair or any other property maintenance issues?" Michael's relief was audible in his voice. "Thank you so much, Ms. Collins. We really appreciate how efficiently these matters are handled. The property management company has been excellent to work with over the years." After ending the call, I looked around the kitchen table at my family, who had just heard me conduct business with neighbors who would be shocked to learn they had been speaking to David's mother about roof repairs and insurance authorizations. "The Hendersons will receive written approval for their roof replacement this afternoon," I explained. They have no idea they were just speaking to the woman they know as their neighbor's helpful mother, who sometimes assists with community events. David shook his head in amazement. "Mom, this is surreal. You've been living this completely double life, managing everyone's housing and business needs while they treat you like invisible domestic help." "It hasn't been intentional deception, David. I simply never corrected their assumptions about my role and identity. When people see what they expect to see, they often don't look any deeper for alternative explanations." The morning had transformed from a family crisis about living arrangements into a comprehensive revelation about identity, power, and respect that would fundamentally change how everyone in our household understood their relationships and responsibilities. Emma and Ryan had fallen asleep in the living room during the adult discussions, exhausted by the emotional intensity that had dominated their home for the past day. As I looked at my sleeping grandchildren, I felt a clarity about what I wanted our family's future to look like. Not the complicated web of hidden identities and subsidized arrangements that had defined the past 3 years, but honest relationships built on mutual respect and genuine affection. Judge Crawford called back that afternoon to confirm our meeting. For the following week, when legal documentation would be prepared for whatever arrangements our family ultimately decided to pursue, property transfers, rental agreements, trust structures, or complete independence, all options would be available based on the choices we made about how to treat each other going forward. Patricia and Amanda left that evening with subdued goodbyes, clearly understanding that their opportunities for managing or manipulating the situation had been dramatically reduced by the revelation of my true position. Amanda's investment schemes had been exposed as potentially fraudulent approaches to someone who had never needed or wanted their business proposals. David and Jessica spent the evening processing everything they had learned, apologizing repeatedly for their assumptions and attitudes, promising to demonstrate better behavior rather than just expressing good intentions. Their remorse seemed genuine, but I knew that sustained change would require time and consistent effort, rather than crisis-driven emotional conversations. As I prepared for bed that night in the house I owned, surrounded by the family I loved, but who had only recently begun to see me clearly, I felt a satisfaction that came not from revenge or vindication, but from finally living authentically. The woman my neighbors had dismissed as just the help had reclaimed her identity and her dignity without cruelty or public humiliation. Tomorrow would bring new challenges as word spread through Willowbrook Heights about their mysterious property owner's true identity. Caroline Mitchell would certainly share her shocking discovery with other neighbors, transforming me from invisible domestic help into the person who controlled their community's future. But tonight, for the first time in 3 years, I fell asleep as Margaret Collins, successful businesswoman and property developer, rather than as David's grateful mother who should be thankful for a place to sleep. The old woman they had overlooked had finally stepped into the light, and the view from there was absolutely magnificent. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.